So today we have to make do with rather primitive means here. I don't know how clear you can see me. Am I visible? I will continue with the lovely A New Look at Heraclitus, published 1962, and is Charles H. Kahn once more, and I need to put my microphone so that you can hear me to some level. Jäklar. Jäklar is Swedish for hello. Or is it? I continue here on page 192, second paragraph, a little bit down. Because of its other uses, it may also carry with it some connotations of rational collecting, arranging or enumerating, and it is these collateral meanings which explain the extraordinary importance of the term in Greek philosophy. The early poets may use logos and mythos as synonyms to denote any speech or story. This is very important to understand that from the beginning logos and mythos were interchangeable and they meant story, something you told, speech. But when the philosophers undertook to distinguish between a rational account and all wives' tales, they naturally opposed logos as reason, meaningful discourse, to mythos, a merely legendary tale. And so it was that the distinction between myth and reason was born. Then I will continue on 193, the column to the right. And we were talking how the bow, once it's drawn, symbolizes both death and life. What a colorful and admirable symbol, and how healing it is. Away from this excludedness, only life, only joy, only day, only summer, which nullifies, as Rodolphe Gasset would have it, everything. You end up is in a sterile desert. No growth, no life, no nothing. Remember how plurality and singularity is the most distinct, most clearest to point to singularity or plurality. It's the same with life and death. If you have only life, it's a weak life. But if you have life and death, their totality, their complementarity really points to life. And for me, when I read that, that told me a lot. I've seen so many people having no life, like in the chapel of the catacomb Edith, for instance, lifeless, clinging on to the lifeless matter she tried to keep as an existence. She had nothing in the end. Both means much more than just the two of them. Complementarity is stronger, and it's also, I think that's the second side of it, both stem from this greater thing. This greater thing therefore has loads more. That is why it's a shame to put them together, because they become less. Worst case scenario is to see them as contradictions, which is by far the most common within both the sacral world and the non-sacral world of today. We end up with nothing. I would say another thing could be taken up there, thinking. Thinking is looked down upon by all philosophers. It should be eradicated. It doesn't serve any purpose. Only as a possible, you can extract from thought representation, as Bertrand Russell and the earlier Wittgenstein suggested. All have been attacking thinking. And of course that tendency came into the New Age movement, the Western tendency, and all of a sudden, and your thoughts, or let your thoughts fly. Horrible things to say, because thoughts is the most valuable thing we have. But it is extremely Western to think in those terms, and that was fairly established already with some of the pre-Socratic, I would say Xenophanes, a god who did not think, or thinking was before action. The bow whose name is life, but whose work is death. The statement concerning the name of the bow must be read not only as a pun, but as a riddle, whose meaning we can guess if we understand Heraclitus' view of the unity of life and death. There are other statements in the fragments unintelligible at first sight, which can properly be understood only as riddles. Heraclitus himself refers to the riddling language of the Delphic oracle, which neither speaks nor hides his meaning, but gives a sign, semenein. The parallel suggests once more that Heraclitus' procedure is conceived of less as a literary device than as an inevitable consequence of human ignorance and the recondite nature of truth. Like the utterance of Apollo, what Heraclitus has to say is necessarily enigmatic, because human beings do not have the insights which divine wisdom can take for granted. For the modern critic, these puns and riddles seem designed to dazzle the reader, not only to catch his attention, but also perhaps, like the Socratic sting of the ignorance, to produce a temporary torpor of the mind that may prepare it for further insight. But Heraclitus would probably have refused to consider this as a result of his skill in manipulating words. It is language itself which by its dual capacity to reveal and obscure provides the natural sign for the multifarious and largely latent connections between things. Like the Sibyl whose prophecies, in virtue not of her own knowledge, but that of God. Heraclitus speaks to us not in his own name, but as a prophet of the Logos, the rational account founded in the cosmic structure that makes all things one. Three, cosmos, fire as one. An understanding of Heraclitus's views on cosmology is complicated by the fact that, whereas the doxographical tradition gives a rather detailed account on what purport to be his physical doctrines, only a relatively small number of the extant fragments are explicitly concerned with questions of natural philosophy. Furthermore, among the physical fragments are to be found such metaphorical statements as all things are exchanged for fire and fire for all things. Such ambiguous assertions as the way up and the way down are one and the same, and such apparently banal remarks, if there were no sun it would be night. There has therefore been an understandable reluctance among modern scholars to accept the classical view of Heraclitus given by Aristotle and his followers, which makes of him an Ionian natural philosopher of the same type as Anaximander and Anaxagoras. Even in antiquity there was perplexity on this point. The ancient literature who forged the correspondence between Heraclitus and Darius was no doubt drawing upon Hellenistic commentaries when he makes the Persian king say to our philosopher, "In some places, if your discourse is interpreted literally, it seems to contain speculations concerning the entire world order and what occurs within it. But there is much room for doubt, and the most learned are at the loss as to your true meaning." At least one ancient critic was more positive. Disputing the accuracy of its customary title, he maintained that the book was not about nature, but about man's life in society. What is said concerning nature serves as a paradigm of example. These ancient statements, based upon familiarity with the book as a whole, confirm the impression made by the extant fragments that Heraclitus is not to be interpreted simply as a natural philosopher, a physikos in Aristotle's sense. From the persons whom he chooses to attack and occasionally to praise, it is clear that he thought of himself primarily as a rival of the poets and the wise men, not the scientist Anaximander, Anaximenes, but the sages Thales and Bias. Xenophanes the poet and Pythagoras the founder of an elite society are those whom he mentions. Pythagoras and Xenophanes provoked particular scorn, for they have tried to expand the new philosophy of nature into a general view of God and man, and have in this view conspicuously failed. And I think it's not so much about failure as just trying to do such a thing. That's the bad thing. To use the natural sciences, the physicos, to tell about nature and man, or God and man, even worse. It is precisely this task which Heraclitus undertakes. His real subject is not the physical world, but the human condition, which for the Greeks means the condition of mortality. His aim is to conceive the relationship of life and death within a universal doctrine of opposition, transformation, and hidden unity. Hence, when he talks about the transformation of the elements, he not only speaks in terms of their reciprocal birth and death, he directly identifies these processes with the birth and death of the soul. Nevertheless, it is clear that Heraclitus' starting point was the cosmology of Miletus. What he says about the transformation of the elements and the passage of opposites, hot, cold, dry and wet, into one another is closely related to the thought of Anaximander fragments, according to which all things perish back into that from which they have arisen. Heraclitus' mention of justice and what is due in fragment 80 seems actually to imply a reference to Anaximander's text. On the other hand, the elemental sequence of fire, water, earth in fragment 31 inevitably suggests the doctrine of Anaximenes. Quote, when the air is spread out in finer form, it becomes fire. Thickening, on the other hand, it forms winds, and clouds are produced by compression. Water by further compression thickens still more, it becomes earth, and in its thickest form, stones. It is apparently this theory of continuous elemental change which inspired Heraclitus' description of the so-called cosmic flux. It scatters and again gathers, forms and dissolves, arrives and departs. Now, if Heraclitus has failed to mention air, winds, clouds and stones in his own version of the cycle of transformation, that is not, I think, because he wished to propose the incredible three-element theory that has been devised for him by modern commentators. He abbreviates the Milesian lists because he has no intention of displaying his polymathia, that learning of many things which his predecessors mistook for wisdom. He can scarcely have meant to deny the importance of the atmosphere as one of the fundamental constituents of the universe, and in fact its role is hinted at in his reference to the prester, or the fiery whirlwind. The motive for introducing this rare and impressive form of atmospheric disturbance in place of the prosaic Milesian list, clouds, winds, rain, etc., is surely the same as that which led him to replace the abstruse apeiron or aer by an ever-living fire. His attention is not to alter the Milesian cosmology in detail, but to reinterpret its total meaning by a radical shift in perspective. Heraclitus' new conception is stated in the most arresting of his cosmological fragments. This cosmos no one of gods or men has made, but it ever was and is and will be an ever-living fire, kindled in measures and measures put out. End of quote. The Milesians were concerned to show how the order of the world had come into being, how it was maintained, and very probably how it would eventually perish. only to be produced anew out of its eternal, inexhaustible source. Anaximander had conceived this order as governed from without by the primordial boundless. Xenophanes had replaced the boundless with an intelligent deity who moves all things by thought. I said that by reducing thoughts to nothing. Heraclitus accepts the Milesian view of a world order in which the opposition and transformation of elementary powers is governed by measure and proportion, but he denies that this order is imposed upon the world by any power from without. Instead, he deifies one of its internal constituents. For to say that fire is ever living, that it ever was and is and will be, is to say simply that it is internal and divine. And I would say that's from inside instead of outside. And this outside is the outside we get when we get too stuck by general contradictions. Then we get this outside. And that outside does its job. It's the creation of the eye who sees everything. And that eradicates knowledge. It's the nullification. And this is why we lost life in the modern world. And instead of seeing life as something good, everybody today, religious, non-religious, atheist, secular, people of piety, never love life anymore. What they fear is solely death. This is what eternal life has been inflated or reduced to today. Something that can be so clearly shown by the Milgram experiment. If you put a priest in the Milgram experiment today, he will kill anyone. He does no longer believe. Well, he believes, but what he believes, no, he believes and he's truthful. But it's a life in contradiction to death. And that's a terrible reduction of life. It is probably worse than death in the Heraclitean version, much worse. So he becomes non-living already in life. And of course that non-life will go on also after his own death. I could put in a parenthesis, this is why secularism and atheism is spreading. No one has any life anymore. And this is what Heraclitus is pointing to. When the Milesian sort of seed for contradiction per se in themselves, that will lead in further development and derivation to the obliteration of everything. And there is no summer, and there is no winter, and there is no day, there is no night. Day is solely the contradiction to night, and day will be our fear of the night. Our life has become the fear of death, not a preservation. And our permanence has been the opposite of impermanence, and thereby reducing it even more in daily life. And our sayings are no longer pointing to one or pointing to two. It's the exclusion of the others. This is what Gachet called reduction of all concepts. Concepts do not show anything more. And this is why Heraclitus later, I will come to that in the next paragraph, puts the sign in the forefront, a sign that really means, a sign that is both material and meaning. A sign of Saussurean complex cannot mean, because it's not of the material and not of the abstract, and then it loses both. And I think that criticism of today in education, all this concept, is because those concepts are vacuous. We need concepts, and I think we had more concepts, but all concepts, if they get immaterial, they will not be abstract. A sign that is random have no power of being pointing. It will be purely abstract, and by abstract in contradistinction to what is firm, material. What a grand man, Heraclitus. Grandeur. I think most religious sects today is sort of a unity or fraternity for fear of death. That's what it's all about. And who in God's name reads these near-death experience books? It is just obnoxious. Sorry to be stern here. I think the anima of Heraclitus entered me for a second. But our friend, the good doctor, he studies his near-death experience books. He has 40 of them. This is fear of death. And the New Agers say, don't cling to life, and then you will receive life. This is also completely wrong. It is simply not that simple. The mistake was done long before we even started to think of it. And it's a bit more sophisticated, bit more deep than puns or word games like that. They all sound a little bit like the saying, don't think of a pink elephant. An order from without that has Newtonian associations. Here is order from within. It's inherent. That's the apparent. The apparent has limit, it has rule, it has things that we can learn. But this transcendental, abstract as a contradiction to the material or real, has nothing. It's a nullification. If you have acid and you put something alkaline, it will be zero. It will be neutral. If you put a positive current to a negative current, you will have nothing. This is in a way what these generalized contradictions can do. And sorry, I say generalized contradictions. It's not that easy. You need to look it into each and every sort of antipode like summer and winter and understand how they truly are. And I think we understood words today in a superficial way. We turn them into... This is why Saussure is so good. I understand more and more why Derrida took him. Because he reduces words to contradistinction only, nothing else. And thereby he also reduces the world, the signified, what's it's pointing to just distinctions. So I think the first reading of Derrida going on at Saussure left me empty. I thought everything was nullified. I think my first hope came in Prague many months ago, early in the year, when I realized that nullification is just what should be looked into and see what it is. It is not that strong. A process is much stronger because a process carries both existence and non-existence. It carries both good and evil, and only good cannot carry anything. It's just the contradistinction to evil, and that is a much more superficial take, distance take. For to say that fire is ever living, that is, that it ever was and is and will be, is to say simply that it is eternal and divine. Yet Heraclitus insists upon the fact that this God participates in the changing life of nature, kindled in measures and in measures put out. There is a genuine parallel here to Anaximenes' conception of the primordial air. But Anaximenes would scarcely have emphasized the extinction of his principle at the very moment that he asserts its eternity, nor would he have identified his elemental principle with the cosmos as such. It is one thing to say all things are derived from air, or even all things in the last analysis are air, though the second formula is, I believe, later and post-Parmenidean. It is something else to identify such an elemental principle with the concrete world order it has engendered, particularly when the principle itself appears as a partial constituent of this order. Now fire, since Anaximander, was held to be a special constituent of the sun, stars, and in general the outer heavens. Thus Heraclitus' statement confronts us with a double paradox of a cosmic whole identified with one of its constituent parts, and an internal principle embodied in the most transitory of visual phenomena. The resolution of these antinomies is inseparable from that of other paradoxical statements concerning the hidden attunement or fitting together, whose fastenings are wholes and not wholes, convergent, divergent, consonant, dissonant, from many and from one many. The eternal life of the perpetually requenched fire, on the other hand, suggests still another set of paradoxical identifications. Quote, immortals are mortal, mortals immortal, living the other's death, dead in the other's life. This network of interrelated paradoxes makes it clear that Heraclitus' doctrine of fire cannot be understood in physical terms alone. The last word is the most important here, alone. In fact, the mere comparison with Anaximenes' theory shows that it was not for physical reasons that Heraclitus placed fire rather than air at the head of his list of transformations. The atmosphere is clearly the natural starting point for the theory of condensation and rarefaction, since only in the movement from cloud vapor to water and back again does one actually see such processes at work. The advantages of fire are of a different sort altogether. They have been well described by Susan Langer in a passage that has no reference to Heraclitus. Fire is a natural symbol of life and passion. Though it is one element in which nothing can actually live, its mobility and flare, its heat and color, make it an irresistible symbol of all that's living, feeling, and active. Heraclitus would certainly not have mentioned passion in this connection. Instead, he might have illustrated his meaning by pointing to the role of fire in the service of the gods and the cremation of the dead, or by alluding to the old stories in which a child is exposed to fire in order to absorb its superhuman life. I also think about James J. Gibson's theory of affordances, that seeing is enough, the process of seeing, nothing transcendental. This is actually what they said until recently, and I would say a good percentage still to this day. So the neurologists is sort of new, but for some reason the process of seeing was not enough. The seeing had to be static. And then of course if you take a logocentric now for each seeing, it will not be enough to have a proper worldview which is static. Gibson fixed this in a gallant way and said it's just enough for reality's movement. And when you see moving thing, you extract exactly what you need, and it's a complementarity of what you see and what is and who you are. I jump a bit here. It is from this wider point of view, not by reference to an element theory alone, that we must understand the statement of fragment 67. That God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and hunger. It becomes other just as fire, when it's mingled with incenses, is named according to the fragrance of each one. If you mix spices or fragrances, it becomes more. They don't nullify each other, just like summer and winter don't nullify each other, and such as life and death don't nullify each other. See life and death as two spices, and understand also that we usually see life not as life, the living, immortal permanence, but we see life today just as the exclusion of death, non-permanence. And then we make it something incredibly smaller. It is like a sort of a perfume with no fragrance, or just two fragrances, when put together, nullify each other because they are negative and positive. This nullification obliterates knowledge, but also permanence, life, and direction. I mentioned it before, the climb bottle is very good to understand. If you go 10 meters up a hill and then 10 meters down a hill, you never come back to the same place. That's the very important understanding of the climb bottle and how space is actually working. And can you also see 10 meters front and then go 10 meters back and come into the same place? That nullifies space. Then there is no space and there is no time. And I would say that is stress, and that would turn into anxiety, and that would turn into friction. You will have nothing. Heraclitus, I'm quite convinced, points to life, an eternal life, and it points to something higher, because we made God into what it's defined, but what is not non-God. And I think that tendency was very clear in the Reformation, when we made every place holy, and thereby no place was holy. And we said that God was everywhere, and thereby he was nowhere. This is the tendencies from the Milesians, or a part of the Milesians, when not informed with knowledge provided by Heraclitus, go down the hill. Leads to destruction. A person that loses his permanence loses his life and loses his daemon, his spirit. Heraclitus is bringing the spirit back. No wonder there is a revival for Heraclitus now. Let me refine this. It would be great to revive Heraclitus into the modern age, and of course in the translation and understanding of Charles H. Can. It was very pleasurable, this. Thank you very much, and have a very pleasant night. Sorry about the darkness.